Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. My name is Arfat, and in today's video, I thought I want to share with you the Islamic Jesus, and we're gonna try and compare with the Trinitarian Jesus, and see. We're not trying to establish which is the true Jesus, because Trinitarian Christians will believe that Jesus is the part of the Trinity, whereas Muslims will never believe that. Right. So in this video, we're not going to provide, we're not going to go through the evidences paper by paper, but we're just going to present one piece of evidence, right, as to why Jesus is definitely not the Jesus of the Trinitarian, because the Trinitarian is a later development. Okay? The Trinitarian view is a later development. And so, if it's a later development, that means the person that appears 400 or 300 or so years before, it cannot be the Trinitarian Jesus, right? And so, the obviously the Muslim Jesus will be drawing materials from the Quran, but the materials that we found in the Quran are also found in the apocryphal Gospels, and are also found in the earlier in the New Testament, basically the New Testament Gospel, right? And so the Quran adds on things that are not found, like the Hawariyun. Okay, the Hawariyun says that they are the helpers of Allah, Surah Al Imran. But somehow you can infer this in the Gospel as well, even though the Hawariyun has been attacked, vehemently attacked by the Gospel authors, for example, Mark, and then has been followed by Matthew. Luke is different. Luke doesn't portray the disciples as, as they don't recognize Jesus and they don't understand Jesus. And so John is the completely opposite world, right? So we're not going to care about John, because according to most historians, John is a later gospel. So there's no point going to John. And we're also not going to go to the Quran, the part of the Quran that actually is not found in the Apocryphal Gospel, and is also not found in the New Testament. Because historically, if we follow the historical rule, the Quran is a later book, right? And so we're not going to go to a later book. So when I say the Jesus of Muslim, um, even Muslims can infer the Jesus of the Quran using the Christian material, right? And so this is different from the other talks that are out there on YouTube, whereby the Muslim Jesus will always to know the Muslim Jesus, speakers will go to the Quran, right? And so I'm trying to avoid that. I'm trying to still uncover the Muslim Jesus in the New Testament. And so, by doing so, obviously, we have to go through the materials that the Quran agrees with in the New Testament. We can draw that and claim that to be the Muslim Jesus, right? Because they are the same, right? And there are three categories whereby they are exactly the same. They're somewhat the same, but there's also differences in there. They're also somewhat the same. And then they're completely not found in the Bible, but is found in the Quran. We're going to narrate all these different, inshallah, we're going to narrate all these different categories, but I will make the distinction as to what is found in the Quran and what is not found in the Quran. So, as a start, we will try to just put it out there, the third category, so that we do not need to return to that, because these are just subcategories that do not necessarily that will not affect our view of the Islamic Jesus, because when we try to talk about the Islamic Jesus using materials from the New Testament, right? Even though we do know ahead of time, because the Quran has already been revealed to us, right? So the materials that agree with the New Testament from the Quran, and also the apocryphal Gospel, and I'm going to explain why. So if we have materials that agree from both camps, the Quran and the Bible, basically the New Testament, right? we can use materials from the New Testament to still draw materials to still draw the Islamic Jesus. I hope you're following along here. All right. So basically, we're trying to infer the Muslim Jesus from the New Testament source and the Apocrypha, right? Even and obviously this will be selective, right? Because we already have the Quran. Right? So let's say if we don't have the Quran, then obviously we have to look at the just play by the historical rule, right? But we're trying to draw the Muslim Jesus using materials from the New Testament. I'm not gonna go to the Tanakh because Jesus never appears in the Tanakh, in the Navim Ketuvim, okay? The Torah Navim Ketuvim, in the Old Testament, right? Jesus does appear in the Talmud, but we're also not going to go there because the Talmud never adds anything new. And the accusation, I've made videos about this, Jesus in the Talmud. You can watch that video. I don't need to repeat it. Bismillah. Right, so we're going to go to the material. So we're going to get rid of the third category here. So what is found in the Quran that is not found in the New Testament and the Apocrypha? And so, like I've said, the Hawariyun, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, who will be the helpers of, who will be the Ansar of Allah? Who will be the helpers of Allah? The Hawariyun, meaning the disciples of Jesus, we don't know who they are. But if we go to the New Testament, we know who they are, even though their names have been anglicized, like Peter, John, Matthew, Thomas, right? Bartholomew, if I pronounce it correctly. I always have problems pronouncing that name. And so, but the Quran never mentions who are the helpers of Allah, who are the Hawariyun, the disciples of Jesus, right? The people surrounding Jesus, they never mention. Allah never mentioned to us. But if we infer from the Israelite narration, the New Testament, then we can somehow, with a grain of salt, we take Peter, John, Matthew, right? James, the son of Zebedee as well. James, the brother of Jesus. Thomas, the twin, right? Whoever these people are. Whether it is actual twin or is it just, someone that, because twin can mean a lot of things, right? And so suppose we take it as it is not Jesus' twin, and brothers could also be akhi, could mean the word akhi or brothers. Therefore, it could also refer to sisters. So it could refer to the awam, the masses, right? And so we need not necessarily use the word in its literal meaning. Okay, but suppose people reject, Jesus doesn't have a sibling. Okay, the Catholic traditions say that Mary remained a virgin. All right, and so suppose we accept the traditional narrative, right, and just go by that way. Not that we need to accept, because these traditions, all right, are just grounded based on tradition, because the New Testament never mentioned that Mary. Because the New Testament only mentioned that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus, right? And that Mary and Joseph never do those sort of things. And so that is why the Catholic tradition believed that Mary remained a virgin, right? And so, but and Mary never married. So James wasn't the brother of Jesus, okay, the physical brother. He's probably brother from Joseph. All right, that is the Catholic tradition. Whereas some Christians don't follow this. Obviously, but some Protestants follow this, right? And so there's a whole range of disagreement in this area amongst the Christian camp, and so we do not need to get into this conversation. There's so many conversations like this already out there. We do not want to add to the confusion, right? Because either way, the Catholic has the position, right? And so if Mary remained a virgin, the New Testament never narrates Mary giving birth to any other than Jesus, and then Joseph and Mary never, do it. And so the Catholic has the higher position there. So the burden of proof is on those who wish to claim otherwise, right? So if we approach from that angle, Adelphoi, the brothers of Jesus, or the twin of Jesus, need not necessarily or definitely were not from Mary, right? And so if they're not from Mary, meaning these words are just symbols, right? Basically, twins could be someone that Jesus is very close to, and this is Thomas. When you have brothers that friends that are very close to, need not necessarily look alike. you know and then James, the brother of Jesus, could basically means his best friend or his brother, adopted brother, half brother from Joseph. All right, and so this is the Catholic position, whereas Islamic position, according to the traditional Islamic position, is the same as the Catholic position. All right, in a sense the same, that Mary remained a virgin. Okay, Maryam alayhi salam remained a virgin, right, the mother of Jesus. And so we do not want I do not want to get into all these different gray areas, so on and so forth. Right, there's a lot of dispute, disagreement here and there. I just want to look at the clear literatures, right? The clear, well, if anything is clear at all, right? If we go to the New Testament, right? So anyway, the third category is that the name Joseph is not even mentioned. The story of Joseph is not even mentioned, and then Mary did not give birth in a stable, in a cave. The Gospel of Peter, uh, the infancy Gospel of Mary or Thomas. Okay, Mary did not give birth in a house. Okay, in fact, she gave birth under a dead palm. We do not know where. If we follow the Christian narrative, different narrative. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Yeah, Allahu alam, we do not know. Okay, the Hadith tradition. Um, we can go to the Hadith tradition as well. I don't reject the Hadith tradition, obviously. I'm not a Quranist. I'm not. We have to accept the authentic Sita, right? The authentic Hadiths as a Muslim. But we're not going to look at the Hadith materials. Okay, um, just going to stick to the scripture, even though Hadith is Hadith Jibril, for example. Or all these are Wahi, revelation. Okay, but we're gonna stick to the Quran, and the New Testament. So the other thing that is mentioned that is not found in the New Testament is the conversation of Jesus and Allah Subhanahu wa Taala at the end of Surah Al-Ma'idah. Yeah, whereby Allah Subhanahu wa Taala asks Jesus, "Did you take your mom and you as deities worthy of worship besides me, beside Allah?" Allah is asking Jesus, and Jesus is saying, "Subhanallah, like, all glory be to you. I would never say things like that. Okay, and if I say them, you will surely know them. All right, and I don't know what is in you, and you know what is in me." And also, whereby Jesus, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is talking to Jesus, and then Jesus responded, "My disciples, while they were with me," obviously I'm paraphrasing because I'm telling a story, right? "While my disciples were with me, I was a witness and watcher over them, right? But when I'm away from them, you are the witness and watcher over them, right? If you wish to punish them," right? This is after when they wanted food brought down from heaven, right? The table spread, right? So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala grant this request of the Hawariyun. Obviously, they invoke Jesus because Jesus was a Nabi, their Rasul, their Prophet, right? Because they invoke Jesus not because they disbelieve, okay? But as we found in the synoptics, right, except in Luke, but they invoke Jesus because they want to be reaffirmed, right? They want assurance that Jesus is really who he's talking about, right? Who Jesus is, who he really was, right? Because Jesus declared that I am a messenger for the Bani Israel, and then no doubt the people that he look, or the people that he actually not look, the, obviously he looked, but the people that he looked after were the Israelites, right? The his Ansar were Israelites. But we don't know whether his helpers or his companions involve Gentiles, but it is highly unlikely, right? Because why would Gentiles believe in a Jewish Messiah, right? The fact that he is called the Messiah, meaning he's from the Jewish tradition, right? And the Quran also mentioned Jesus. The Quran quotes Jesus that he is a prophet to the Bani Israel, the lost sheep of Israel, according to the Gospel, according to Matthew. Right? And so Jesus was sent to the Israelites. And so Israelites basically means the descendant of Moses, okay, the prophet Moses. And so we need not speculate. Most probably Gentiles are not included. Because if we look at the New Testament, the Gentile audience belongs to Saul or Paul, right? Saul is, we found this in the book of Acts, the name Saul. People call him Saul, but actually his name Saul. It was a Hebrew name. Paul was a Jew, yes. Paul was a Hebrew. So anyway, um, Allah SWT sent down the food from heaven. But before that, Allah SWT set a clause that if after this, anyone disbelieve, we will punish those people with the punishment that we have never, okay, that we have never gave to any other nations. Yeah, and this is very important. We will return to this verse. Okay, we will return to this verse, inshallah. So there's a couple of other things. Okay, now we move to the second category, right? And then I want to bring in the story of Zechariah as well, and Mary, right? And so we found similar things whereby in the Quran, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was in a mihrab, was in a room. Probably some scholars say behind a curtain, but then people conflate this to be because the word curtain is also mentioned in the New Testament gospel, right? So people thought that Mary was in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. Definitely not, because only the priests can go in there, and women were definitely not allowed in that area, right? Because there's a woman section in the temple of Solomon. There's a woman section there, and the Holy of Holies, only the high priest can go inside once a year during Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, right? But the priest, the high priest, would go and invoke forgiveness on behalf of all the nations, right? Of the Israelites, obviously. So only during the day of Yom Kippur, whereby the high priest can enter the Holy of Holies. So this interpretation whereby Mary, the mother of Jesus, was in the Holy of Holies is definitely wrong. Okay, definitely wrong. Even though Zechariah was a priest, right? But and definitely he was amongst the higher class, so to speak, right? Because they actually chose. Remember when they throw lots? Okay, Zechariah was chosen, right? So it could be that he was just a normal priest, but then after he was chosen, he was elevated, right? So Allahu alam, but it seems likely to be that way. And so Zachariah was chosen, and this is also found, right? Yeah. And then Allah Subhanahu wa Taala gave food to Mary, and then Zachariah saw the food and asked, "Who gave you this food?" Okay, and then Maryam alayhi salam said that this is from Allah. Okay, this is Surah Al Imran. And then Zachariah also wants to, Zachariah also make dua to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. Right, because Maryam alayhi salam says that Allah is the provider of rizq, provider of sustenance, right? And so Zachariah also prayed for sustenance in the form of a son. And then John the Baptist, this is where we get to John the Baptist. John the Baptist. These characters I still bring up because they're related to the story of Jesus. They're all within the household, right? The family of Imran. Um, we will get to the interpretation of Imran in a bit. And so John the Baptist or Yahya, no one had the name Yahya before Yahya, right? As Quran mentioned. Okay, we have given you this name whereby we have never given anyone before. And so there are two ways to interpret here. Okay, whereby because Yahya was a Nabi, was a prophet. He wasn't a messenger, meaning he wasn't given revelation. He followed on the revelation of Moses, the Torah. Right. So, if we make, even though we do not make distinction amongst prophet, right, amongst the messengers of Allah, and this is the warning of the Quran, right, not to make distinction. But when it comes to the grading of the prophethood, right, the Injil was given to Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. Okay, so John the Baptist, even though he was a prophet, but he wasn't given any new revelation. Okay, his role as a prophet was to establish and continue, keep on reminding the message of the Torah, right? Now, we're gonna take a tangent here. When was the Zabur revealed? And is the Zabur the Psalms? Okay, if you read the Psalms, you as a Muslim, if you read the Psalms, you will not believe that this is the Zabur, right? Um, because the Psalm contains poetries that are erotic, poetries that are definitely you can't imagine the Prophet of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala would actually recite or reveal this. And Psalms are poetry, and it fits well with the Jewish narrative that Dawood alayhi salam was actually a musician, right? And this is something that is difficult for Muslims to accept. And if we look at things from an Islamic perspective, all right, we're not in the realm of historical analysis yet. We're just looking at the literatures and comparing literatures. All right, comparing literatures between the two, comparing the same narrative between the two literatures, right? And so, in my humble opinion, the Psalms definitely are not the Zabur. Parts of the Psalms, yes. Okay. Parts of the Psalms, yes, but definitely not the Psalms that we have. A huge chunk of it, definitely not. Okay. Even though if you remove the Psalms from the from the Torah, from the Tanakh, it is actually a huge chunk. It is a huge chunk if you remove the Psalms. Some goes on to the hundreds. Now, if you remove the Psalms, it can be. It seems like it is a book on its own. It is almost comparable in size to the New Testament, almost, at least the Gospels where we put together, right, around there. And so it can be the revelation given to David, alayhi salam. And then another one we have the Apocrypha, the Psalms of Solomon. People attributed this to Solomon, the son of David, right? Sulaiman ibn Dawood. Again, Songs of Solomon is an apocryphal book, but apocrypha only because of what? If you know your church history, apocrypha only because the Catholic deem it so. Catholic, I don't mean the Roman Catholic. Catholic as in the universal church, right? When the word Catholic was used in the past, it basically means universal church. Until the Protestant, every Christian was either Orthodox or Catholic, Eastern Orthodox or Catholic, the major ones, right? And then Protestant Reformation, obviously Luther, we have the Reformed Church, and then subsequently we have the Calvin Church, so on and so forth, right? Baptist, and so on and so forth. All these are Reformed Church that had carried on the traditions of the Catholics, but do not want to admit it. Okay, that's basically it. And this is not my argument. This is the Catholics' argument, right? This is Catholics' argument because the Protestant accept the church fathers. The church fathers were Catholics. All right, Catholics, not Roman Catholics. Catholics as a universal church. Okay, and so um, again, I have to make go deeper here. Catholics only to the Western Church, right? For example, Augustine was a west part of the Western tradition. But then, if you go to for example, the earlier church, the earlier fathers like Origen, right? He was an Alexandrian, right? And then later Caesarean Palestinian. Origen, Eusebius, even Arius, right? Eusebius of Nicomedia, Eusebius of Ankara. All these were Eastern fathers, right? And the Eastern, pretty much the early source. Again, I do not want to get into this tangent. So let's return to our topic. And so, what are the narratives? So John the Baptist is also mentioned. John the Baptist, the story of John the Baptist beheading is not found in the Quran, though the Jews are accused of killing the Prophet of Allah unjustly. Okay, not that there's any just to this killing, right? But the fact that the Quran mentions unjustly, okay, is a very strong point because people would think, how come? What is there such thing as just killing? No, there's no such thing as just killing. Right, killing the Prophet of Allah, there's no such thing as a just killing the Prophet of Allah. I mean, you're justifying the killing of the Prophet of Allah. No, there's no such thing as justifying the killing of the Prophet of Allah. Right. So people sometimes misunderstood this. So that means this Quran is not making sense. Is the Quran saying that there's such thing as justice in killing the Prophet of Allah? No. Right. It's because that was the crime of the Jews. Right. And whatever act they do is unjust. Right. And there's no justice in killing the Prophet of Allah. Right. And so they were killing the Prophet of Allah unjustly. And was John the Baptist beheaded according to the gospel tradition? Or was he beheaded at the request of the daughter of what is it called, the king of the Jews of Judea? And Allah alam, right? The Quran never alludes to that. Okay. And so what happened to Zachariah? Again, we don't know. Okay, we don't know what happened to Zachariah. But John the Baptist, we have the cult of John the Baptist. Okay, and if we go to the Gospel of John, there seems to be the Johannine community seems to have a problem with the cult of John the Baptist. Okay, obviously Johannine community was the cult of Jesus, and then they have problem with the cult of John the Baptist. Allahu alam, right? That is if we go to the Gospel of John, and this is definitely an area that is lacking in research material. Okay, and so for those of you who want to do your PhD dissertation in this would be a great idea to explore. Because there's not a lot of materials here. They're actually trying to uncover the early Zacharian cult, meaning those who actually followed the teachings of Zachariah. Right? Our historical narrative is historical literatures is lacking in this research. Even though the materials, people are not interested in this area. They are more interested in Jesus, John the Baptist, right? So if you want to do your PhD dissertation in the cult of Zachariah, for example, that is a great area for you to actually add materials to the academic world. Also, the other areas that lack research material is the cult of John the Baptist. Even though it is there, right? But the relationship of John the Baptist with the Essenes. Remember, the Essenes were there, and John the Baptist was out in the Jordan in the wilderness. The Essenes were out in the wilderness as well. And so was John the Baptist from the Essenes, Allah Alam. Right? And so areas of research needs to go actually in there. And areas of research, if we are able to do a comparison, right, to the Quran and the Islamic narrative, there will be an even greater publication if one is able to write. Again, this material is lacking. Lacking when it comes to comparing the materials of the Quran and comparing the materials of the Jewish literatures, right? Because they are scenes. We have Qumran, the writings there, right? So if we examine the Islamic teachings of John the Baptist, and if we look at Islamic tradition, obviously we need to do criticism of the sources as well, right? But if we just look at the narrative criticism, narrative comparison, it will be nice to read papers on this area. Right. There are papers out there, right? But the only problem is that there's a lot of unpublished dissertation. And how do I know this? Because when you read works of scholars, they actually cite unpublished dissertation. Right? If you read the footnotes, if you read footnotes from scholars, they cite a lot of times actually from unpublished dissertation. Right? And so, and these dissertations are unpublished, but not necessarily they're not available online. Okay, they're available. Some scholars publish their dissertation through academia, so on and so forth. Right. And so, returning back to our narrative. So, what can we infer from the Quran? From what can we infer from the New Testament and deem it the Islamic Jesus? If we go to Mark, we have to go to Mark. If we play by the historical rule, we have to go to Mark, because Mark is our earliest gospel, right? And we have to go to Q as well, because Q is also our earliest gospel. If we go to the Apocrypha, right? The Apocrypha is only the Apocrypha because the Catholic deem it to be the Apocrypha. Whereas if we look at all materials from the same lens, through the same lens, Apocrypha is actually not the Apocrypha as well. Because some Apocrypha were written much earlier than some of the books in the New Testament. Second Peter's was probably written around the year 150. The Gospel of Thomas was written much earlier, around 120. Some scholars date it much earlier, but normative consensus is 120. Right. So why is the Gospel of Peter in the second letters of Peter in the New Testament, but the Gospel of Thomas is not inside? Right. So we cannot just base on the dating. People would say that the Gospel of Thomas is not in the New Testament because it is a later Gospel. Okay. Those who make this claim are completely ignorant, and they're actually shooting themselves in the foot. Because the book of John, the epistle of John, were much later. The book of Acts were much later. The book of Acts now have been dated past 100 CE, around the same time as the Gospel of Thomas. Right? So those who claim that the apocryphal books were much later, is shooting themselves in the foot as well, because they're not inconsistent. They're cherry picking. Right? When it comes to literatures of the New Testament, these are all early. Why? Because it bears the name Peter, meaning Peter cannot have been writing in 150s. He'll be dead, right? So Peter was probably writing around the year 40s, according conservative. But we have the Gospel of Peter. Why don't you include that inside? Oh, because they're apocrypha, but they have the name Gospel of Peter, right? And so you see the inconsistencies there, right? And so historians, if historians were to approach this from a conservative perspective, the entire conclusion will be flawed. okay? Because the methods itself is flawed. So the methodology is flawed. What about the conclusion? Obviously, it will be flawed. So we have to ignore the word apocrypha, ignore the chronological datings of this book. I mean, ignore the word apocrypha and ignore the word New Testament and look at the chronology of these books, right? And so if you look at the chronology of these books, Mark and Q is our earliest sources, right? It's our earliest sources. And actually, Paul is our earliest sources, but Paul is not a witness. Right? Paul claimed to be a witness, but Paul is not a witness. Okay? Suppose today you do something wrong, okay? And then you go to the judge, and the judge is saying, "Oh, I had a vision of Jesus. Okay, Jesus appeared to me." You know, will the judge actually believe you? No, the judge will not believe you. And so, why the inconsistencies there when it comes to the New Testament? Paul believed. Paul must have been right. Paul cannot have been lying. Right? Paul cannot this. Paul cannot that. You know. Well, where's your evidence then that Paul cannot have been lying? Right? These are theology. We are not doing theology. We're trying to do history. Right? So if you want to be inconsistent in your theology, so be it. But don't be inconsistent when it comes to doing history. Right? Because we are trying to establish historical truth here. Right? We're trying to establish, based on the given evidence and data that we have, the most plausible historical chronological breakdown or outlines of the man Jesus. Who was he? Not what was he. Right? Because if you look at history, Jesus was a man. Even the New Testament mentioned this. A man approved of God. Okay, this is what Peter mentioned. Right? So why do you go to the selective passages and ignore the other passages? Right? And so it doesn't make sense to me. There's so many inconsistencies. So anyway, returning to the New Testament. So we go to Mark. Mark is very specific, and Q as well. There is no resurrection scene in Q. And there's no resurrection scene in Mark. Okay, no resurrection scene. Well, people would say that the man in the tomb towards the ending of Mark mentioned that he has been raised. Right? He mentions he has been raised. Mark mentions he has been raised. Right? But Jesus never. There's no mention that Jesus has been raised. Right? Even though the narrative implies that he has been raised, meaning Jesus has been raised. But the fact is that Jesus himself never say that admits he has been raised in Mark. So there is something important here, because Mark is saying Jesus has been raised, right? But Mark wasn't an eyewitness to begin with. None of these gospel authors were eyewitness. Right? When I'm saying raised here, right, I will explore raised. It could mean two things, right? It could mean raised from the dead or raised up to heaven, right? But we're not going to go there because it would take us another hour or so to break down the Greek verb, right? But there's no resurrection scene. Okay, narrative. No resurrection narrative in Q. And the resurrection narrative is filled with contradiction. It cannot happen the way. If you look at the ending of Matthew, Luke, John, and Mark, right? Ignore Mark because Mark there's no resurrection narrative. Right? After the resurrection, post-resurrection narrative. If you look at just Luke, Matthew, and John, it cannot happen the way it is, because these are impossibilities. These are contradictions, right? Theologically, you can give it that, because if you ignore theological methods and historical methods, right, you can pretty much interpret anything you want, right? So that is up to you. But when it comes to doing history, you need to play by the historical rules, because this is consistent throughout all the other literatures. Right? Suppose you read three different works and they all say three different things, and the event only says that it can only happen one time and it can only happen once. The way it can only happen one way, it cannot happen three different ways, right? If you go to the other literatures, most Trinitarians will say, there's a contradiction. But when the same criteria is applied to their gospel, because it affects their theology, their inerrancy belief of the Bible, they will not admit this. They will come up with different reasons. Why don't you come up with the same reason to reconcile the other literatures that are non-biblical? Why the inconsistency, right? John Barton mentioned in Mark 10:18. This is the most explicit statement. If there is only one statement that Mark says, this is definitely it. This is definitely it. And so Jesus is saying, why do you call me good? In fact, in the Greek, why me you call good? Right? The King James, why callest me good? Why me? He brought the emphasis forward. Why me you call good? Only God is good alone. Right? If you read this, and if you found this passage in a different literature, you'll not impose your Trinitarian ideas to this passage. But when it comes to the gospel, you impose your Trinitarian beliefs. Right? In fact, some of the commentaries that I've read goes to a certain extent to say that, Jesus actually is not denying he is good, because he is called good. He admits being good in the other gospels. Well, those are the gospels. In Mark, right, there's no other mention of Jesus being good. There's no other mention of Jesus being good in Mark. And the only mention of good is actually Jesus denies that he is good. Right? So, for example, suppose a man walking on the street and say, good teacher, good rabbi, okay, what must I do to have eternal life? And then the rabbis told the person, why me you call good? Only God is good alone. How else would you interpret that? How else would you interpret that? You will interpret that the rabbi is denying being good. So why is it when you read this literature, you're trying to say that, Jesus is not denying to be good, Jesus is not denying to be God. In fact, this is affirming him as God. It's like, it is, how did you even get there? This is mind-boggling. Right? If you have read the evangelical literatures, the whatever they say and whatever the conclusions they end up with, there's no link. There's no link. For example, in Four Portraits, One Jesus, okay, the book Four Portraits, One Jesus, in the chapter of Gospel of Mark, right? This is the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Okay, the Son of God, if you go to the critical edition of the Greek text, it says that this is not found in one of the earliest, best attested to manuscript. Okay, and this is noted as well in the author of Four Portraits, One Jesus. But somehow the conclusion is this is affirming Jesus as, affirming this verse is definitely in there. It's like, you just admit that this is not found in the earliest, best attested to manuscript. But then your conclusion is that, this verse is in there. Right? It contradicts whatever your evidence, your material evidence actually indicates. Right? And so you're trying so hard, you spend your entire night writing thesis, trying to argue that this verse is not in there, and trying to survey whether this verse is in there, Theo, right, the Son of God. whether it is in there, and then you came out with the evidence that prove that it is not in there. It is a later scribal expansion, right? Addition. But then in your conclusion page, you say that this verse is in there. It's like, what are you talking about? And if you survey if you survey how, first things first, I do research in trying to think in. I'm interested in trying to look at how people study, okay? Especially when how people study the gospel. Okay? And so, in order for me to gain empirical evidence, right, I have to go and look at tons of Bible study videos. And you can do the same. Look at how just average Christian that uploads videos on YouTube, how they actually study the Bible. Look at the literatures that they use, right? Just watch 100 Bible study videos, watch, Bible reviews, so on and so forth. Go and look at all these videos, okay, and actually look at how they actually study. Right? When I look at all these videos, I look from the first second all the way to the very last second. And I pay attention to every single word that they say. And I look at the literatures that they have, and I look at how they try to describe these verses. And I also pay attention especially to which literatures they consult in trying to gain a deeper understanding of the passage at hand, right? And so if you look at when I say all, if you look at a huge chunk, okay, well, I cannot say you, so I must say when I look at all this huge chunk of videos of people actually uploading their Bible study videos, right? There's a lot of methodological flaws in how they actually study the Bible, right? A lot of them, it's very difficult to say because people use different methods to study, right? But if you actually, and the purpose of their studies is mostly from a devotional perspective, right? And so this is also one of the premise that it is actually incorrect to begin with, right? But most people engage religion from a theological perspective, and this is something that we have to keep in mind, right? And so when people engage the study of scripture from a theological perspective, right, only a small portion will actually engage it from a historical perspective, and only a even smaller portion would engage from a comparative religion perspective, meaning they look at the ancient Near East literature, they look at all these different literatures, right? Only a few of them would actually do these comparative studies, right? Because first things first, people, the people that I've watched, right, they don't actually know how to read critically. They don't read critically, not that they don't know, right? They don't read critically from a historical perspective, right? They read critically from a theological perspective. Okay? And most of the time, you find them going to literatures that confirms what they want to believe. The literatures that they have on their shelves, in the shelves, okay, confirms their theology, so to speak, right? And so there's no point then in having these literatures, because you're just buying literatures to confirm your faith, to confirm your beliefs. Even though you want to know more about a passage, right? Obviously, you can buy any literatures because you want to know more about the passage, right? But it is the literatures that you buy. The literatures that you buy are mostly from Zondervan, from Holman, from what about Tyndale, what are Thomas Nelson. Okay, what are the all these literatures that are catered more towards evangelical. In all the surveys that I've done, right? I'm not talking because I do surveys about what the literatures that scholars has as well. Yeah, and I've made videos talking about the knowledge that scholars have and the awam, the layman, is a huge gap. It's a huge gap. Scholars know a lot about textual criticism, about higher criticism, about how to make proper exegesis, so on and so forth. But somehow the average people are not being taught this. Right? Partly because the average people do not want to explore this, right? And so we can't put the blame. There's no blame game here, right? It depends on people's interests, right? But a lot of them actually don't have a sound method. Number one, method of study, method of interpretation, right? And they do not want, or they're afraid to actually explore literatures that have been labeled liberal, so to speak. All right, they are afraid to explore that because they only want to read literatures that confirm their theology, not necessarily confirm their understanding of the passage, but confirm their theology. And that is why you have people believing that they read the material evidence as a proof that these passages was actually written much later on. Mark never mentions the name of the author, right? And the material evidence prove that Mark cannot have been written by Mark. But somehow the conclusion says that, oh, tradition is correct, whereas the material evidence is wrong. How can it be wrong? How there's Mark never wrote Mark. Mark never claimed to wrote Mark. The Gospel of Mark never mentions that Mark wrote Mark. So how can this be wrong and tradition be right? How can this be wrong? So which is why they spend a lot of time arguing or surveying the literatures, right? And they hit a brick wall. They can't make Mark say that Mark actually wrote Mark. And so the material evidence proved that Mark actually didn't write Mark because Mark never claimed to write Mark, right? And then the tradition, the very first time a gospel author, these gospels were called by their names were much later, 180s. When Justin Martyr was writing, Justin Martyr was saying Memoirs of the Apostle, right? And so they will go to all these early traditions like Papias. Eusebius quote Papias. And if you actually read, for example, Matthew, if you read the description, but this was Aramaic gospel. The Matthew that we have now is not Aramaic. The Matthew that we have now is Greek, and Matthew never claimed to write Matthew. Right? Where is the Aramaic gospel that Papias actually mentioned? Right? And so this is a deficit when it comes to knowledge. People choose to just read conclusion instead of actually engaging with the materials one by one. Right? They would appeal to authority. Oh, these scholars say this Fulan say this Fulan is a pastor of this church, this Fulan has millions of followers, this Fulan is a great preacher, so how can he be wrong, right? He claimed to have the Holy Spirit, right? So how can he be wrong? This Fulan teach at this theological seminary, this Fulan, they appeal to authority. And so they do not want to actually engage with the materials one by one, right? Because they're not interested in engaging with the materials. And so they'll never actually know. Whereas if we really seek to know, we have to go and explore deeper. We have to read literatures from both sides, right? I have literatures from both sides, as much literatures that I have from one side, from the historical side and from the more conservative side, from the more liberal side, from the conservative side, right? I have commentaries written by evangelical pastors. Most of my study Bibles were from a devotional perspective, right? I have introduction to the New Testament and Old Testament. They are written from a devotional perspective, right? I have surveyed more than 25 different introduction to the New Testament, probably 20 to 25 around there, right? And only about 4 of them, right? Raymond Brown's introduction, Ehrman's introduction, Dale Martin's introduction, Delbert Burkett's introduction, and the Fortress Press introduction, Anatomy of the New Testament, right? Pretty much that's all. And the rest were all written from a conservative devotional perspective, right? Because I want to engage with the arguments from the other side and see which one is actually more uh, not appealing, which one is actually more what's the word here, more convincing, right? And so we have to not be one-sided, but unfortunately, if you survey a handful of videos out there about people just uploading videos of their Bible studies, right, is ultimately one-sided from a theological perspective. They do not wish to explore the different methods, the different criticism, so on and so forth, right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully, even though this talks about Jesus in the Quran, using the New Testament Gospels, right? But it seems that the video have strayed into a rant instead. But inshallah, we will return to this topic again in the future. I'm not sure when, right? But until then, I'll see you on my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.